Welcome to the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Joel.
I'm Leo. For anyone just tuning in, this podcast is centered on having long format discussions about books we've read, and we dive into both fiction, nonfiction. The only thing better than reading a good book is having a great discussion about it, and we want to include you in the conversation.
So I would be ecstatic if you reached out to us at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com, Patreon/deepdivebookclub, X at deepdivebookclub, deepdivebookbc, as in Bravo Charlie, Instagram/deepdivebookclub, YouTube at deepdivebookpod. Any of those places, please reach out to us and we can continue the conversation.
So we are going to pick up right where we left off in our discussion of the happiness hypothesis. And we are on chapter 8. And we talked about it briefly in the overview, but that was forever ago. So as a quick review, chapter 8 is the felicity of virtue. And in it, Haidt discusses the potential role virtue plays in living a happy life. Remember, Haidt has looked at many different directions and places that we can start piecing together a hypothesis about what actually makes people happy. And in this chapter, he examines virtue, and he contrasts how we think of virtue now versus our common understanding of it before about World War I. The modern common sense of virtue is the performance of altruism. If someone says virtue, most of the time we almost have that in our minds synonymous with altruism. In the time of Benjamin Franklin, however, virtue was seen more as excellence of character. The author uses this contrast of different ways of thinking about virtue as a platform to examine what he calls the virtue hypothesis, which is simply that cultivating virtue will make you happy. And we'll talk more about cultivating virtue here in a second. Haidt argues that employing something like Benjamin Franklin's understanding of virtue can lead to a more meaningful, happier life than the modern version, which is something like altruistic behavior is good for you. So two different ways of looking at virtue. The way we've thought about it has changed over the years. And in the overview, Joel, we did talk about Benjamin Franklin and his system, but not in detail. So I want to jump into that. But before I do you have any thoughts you want to add in here?
The thoughts I have are more meta about this because I wanted to say, wow, what a time to get into the third part of this. I'm so excited. Let's dive deep into this last little section, and we'll make this episode a little bit shorter than the other two because we really hit this book hard, and I'm so glad we did. And I'm excited, Leo, to hear about the felicity of virtue.
Making the episode short is a fun aspiration. We'll see if that actually happens. Okay, so Joel, let's get a little bit more deep into Benjamin Franklin's actual approach to cultivating virtue. So he did this in a deliberate, almost engineering-like way. To use another way of modern thinking retroactively applied to Benjamin Franklin, it's we would call it more of a self-improvement project that he had for himself. And we get the most details of this from his personal autobiography, and he's actually set up for himself a system of moral training, so to speak. And he thought that people don't simply become virtuous through good intentions. He believed that having and cultivating virtue required having a very clear definition, setting up habits, measuring, repetition, self-observation and reflection, and also, like we talked about in Atomic Habits, a type of social or societal environmental reinforcement for that. Very interesting ways he was thinking about this back then.
That sounds very scientific engineering as an approach towards developing the individual.
Okay, would you like to know the 13 virtues that he made a list of?
Give them to me.
These are interesting. So, temperance, silence, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. Very interesting list. And we wouldn't necessarily think of some of these as virtues today in our modern society.
Some of them I don't even think Benjamin Franklin attuned to in any capacity.
Well, for example, temperance, he says, quote, "Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation." But we know that Benjamin Franklin, he liked his food.
He absolutely liked his food. He was quite pudgy by the end of his life. And I love the chastity one because he literally talked about having sex with woman after woman each night when he was a diplomat in France.
Right.
Zero chastity. And also...
Maybe he's got a different interpretation of what chastity means. And the silence one's interesting because he was a professional diplomat and he was known for his eloquence and his conversations. That was why he was our diplomat to France. And I guess his idea of silence is speak only what benefits yourself or others, which, hey, if you're only saying things that benefit yourself or others, then, I guess you don't need to be that silent. We don't need to go through the rest, but that's just an interesting list that he made as a virtue. It's interesting, glancing through it. Cleanliness is a virtue. That's an interesting thought. Cleanliness, I think, would just be not so much a character trait as just habit, but maybe it is a character trait.
That's like the old saying, cleanliness is next to godliness.
That's one I would love to kind of dive into in the history of that thought and the history of how we have thought of cleanliness.
That would be a fun dive into the history of the idea of cleanliness, but I do agree with it. The external reflects the internal, and I feel like if you walk into someone's home and you see the cleanliness state of it, you are peering into their soul in that moment.
Some people are feeling attacked right now, Joel. Don't call the listeners out like that. That is the virtues that he worked on. He came up with a detailed tracking system, which is, a pen and paper version of an Excel sheet where he had days of the week listed out, and he had these different virtues listed on the other axis, and he just cross-referenced, okay, I'm working on this day, I'm working on this day. Did I do something here? So he had his whole habit tracking and was employing behavioral psychology on himself way back in revolutionary times. So Joel, now that we've taken that dive into cultivating virtue and the system that Ben Franklin has, what do you think of this idea of cultivating virtue? Because we think more in terms of like self-improvement in general in our society. It's not necessarily common to think of specifically cultivating virtue.
With cultivating virtue, what do the kids call aura farming to get social status? I think part of us being social creatures is us wanting other people to view ourselves as good or better. And that's a perfectly natural thing, and we don't necessarily need to disparage that like, oh, you should do things just for the character of it. No, there's very real life benefits to other people thinking you are virtuous or you are of good character.
Right, but that's cultivating appearance, or as you said, an aura. You were going somewhere with that?
The felicity of virtue, and coming back to what he's talking about, my understanding of what he's deriving from quote-unquote ancient wisdom is being a virtuous person or being a person of good character will ultimately lead to long-term happiness because you are developing a person in the future and investing in that person for them to be happy is my interpretation of it. So not only are you adding the aura farming or anything else that you can get from it, but you are also providing future self with, well, you can feel good about these things or you can feel happy because of the actions you've done or taken. And maybe it's a more modern idea of this chiseling and engineering style of getting to that person. But also I feel like people end up feeling burnt out by constantly trying to have that self-improvement. And we've talked about that before on the podcast of ad nauseum self-improvement leads to that psychological burnout.
So we're looking at it through the lens of self-improvement, which is essentially what Ben Franklin was doing, and bringing that also to the lens of looking at it through Burnout Society by Byung-Chul Han. There is a downside to seeing the self as project. There's a downside to focusing too much on yourself as a medium for your goals. Like, oh, I need to improve X, Y, and Z. On the other hand, that's how things get done. And if you're not taking a purposeful stance on how your character is developing, then I can understand, if you do the extreme, okay, if I am continuing to do what I'm doing and bringing myself to bear into the world the way I'm doing it currently, fast forward that 5, 10, 15 years, what is the natural progression? What's the natural place I'm going to end up with? It's, I see both sides of it. The idea, though, that cultivating virtue is a potential method for happiness it's interesting, and it's not something that I've encountered put this way, the way Jonathan Haidt put it. It's almost using a personality psychology argument for what traditional religions have told people. Like, religions have told people you need to be good because there's a divine order and reason for you to be good, and you're aligning yourself with what the beneficent divine order of the universe is doing, and so you can be more like the divine, and that's good for you and the people around you and the world you live in. Whereas this is excluding that argument. Just in my head, I'm seeing this as almost a purely psychological and sociological argument for what, just in general, being good or working on being good. Interesting.
Pulling this down to the personal level and getting it out of the, I don't want to say cloud of academic research or cloud
less abstract.
Yeah. Pulling this down to our personal level, that virtue seeking in a way, done at the right amount, is helpful for a person's happiness. And pulling it down to just one day, if I work out that day or I run that day and I don't get as much done as I want to, I'm not as productive, I still have at least I did this. At least I worked towards this goal of self-improvement. That leaves me with more lasting dopamine. When at the end of the week or the end of the month, when I've practiced my language or my music, every single day, and I can see the benefits of that over a longer span. That gets a little bit more into the atomic habits mentality of repeating and repetition. But those things in my head can give you more lasting effects because I think back like, okay, at least I did this. At least I have accomplished this, even if I'm not having a good day.
And what you're talking about there is our specific habits, language practice and music practice and those types of things. But if you look at the meta level right above that, I think that is what is being talked about here in this chapter. And Jonathan Haidt doesn't use this word, but the common numerator across all of everything that you're talking about is discipline. And he doesn't necessarily use the word discipline in discussing virtues and cultivation and how that might lead to happiness, but that is the best way I can think about what he's talking about, because those things make you happy, but getting yourself to do them is a prerequisite for getting happiness from those habits and getting the happiness you get from moving towards your goals of being better at language, being better at music. And the prerequisite for that is having enough ability to influence your own behavior to get yourself to do the same thing day in and day out so that progress can be made. If you did not have enough of a handle on yourself to influence your own behavior, aka discipline, then you would just kind of be wallowing in a sea without a sail. You know what I mean? So for me, that's how I wrap my head around what he's saying here. Is that how you see it, or you have a slightly different view on it?
No, that's how I see it. I just wanted to pull it back from the terms because we're an audio medium, and it gets lost in this time length of all of these words and sentences we've said, adding from Benjamin Franklin and Haidt. I want to pull it down to a application.
The way you're saying it is helping me understand that part of it. It helps me clarify the way I'm seeing it.
But I agree with you, and I think as a parent, when you think about your child and helping them develop character and helping them develop that idea of like, well, what do I do? What are my actions when no one's looking? I think ultimately it ends up helping them with their long-term happiness because they can feel better or feel proud of who they are as an individual.
Right. The pride you get from, a good record, whether it's of discipline action or performance academically or in a career, the prerequisite of that, I think, is what he's talking about here.
Exactly.
And in my head, I keep having to do that translation of cultivating virtue is more so cultivating discipline. And that's not quite exactly what he's talking about here, but that's the handle I have on it for making it work in my brain. Joel, so I have that kind of almost a feeling of surprise that cultivating virtue is a specific way of achieving happiness. When you encountered this idea, was it surprising for you, like the way he's laying it out here?
As I was reading it, my feeling was, Haidt is talking about a truth in different words. And I find this quite often as we get to go through so many different books, especially strong books from research or powerful books from historical context, like the current one that we're trying to finish up, The Idiot by Dostoevsky. I find that many times there's not a huge number of truths. There's a small number of truths, but there's so many different ways of looking at those. They present differently. And that's what I found here is, we talk about in martial arts being disciplined and getting the right movements, and you just do it for the sake of repetition and getting the body to have that right structure. And then you get to see the application of that as you spar or apply it in martial arts. And the discipline itself is its own virtue, but when you start cultivating the mentality behind why you're doing that discipline, or the mentality behind why you go to martial arts class every week, that's when you start cultivating that virtue. And so I agree with Haidt, and when I read it, I was like, I know this, but it's now in a new costume. It's in a new form.
And just a little digression, I think, but that's what you're saying. Something you already know, but presented in a novel way is, I agree, one of the best benefits of going through these books. And then we get a compounding effect. This is why we talk about these books together. This is why we have a book club. It's a compounding effect, because not only do we get to see, novel ways of presenting things we've already seen, but on top of that, we get access to other people's perspectives on those ideas. So yes, I get the book, but then I get to discuss your version of the book, my version of the book, everyone else's version of the book that they come away with, the takeaways they have, the perspective they have on it. And that's why in the intro we say the only thing better than reading a good book is having a great discussion about it, because that's where I learn the most from. Like, I really enjoy reading, but that's a solitary activity. And I really enjoy having discussions with people and having what I call brain time, where we get to share ideas and work on ideas together. And this podcast and meeting with a book club in person is just the ultimate combination of two of the things I really love. And we get that compounding effect.
I mean, you're really helping solidify all these ideas, because you get to tap those ideas at least 4 times.
True. A little peek behind the curtain. Yeah, I do see these ideas over and over and over again, because in our in-person book club where I'm reading the book, and then I also write up lengthy discussion prompts, and then we discuss it, and then most of everything we read in our in-person book club ends up in the podcast form. So you are correct. I get to experience 4 different levels of the information and processing it in new ways. But that's a little peek behind the curtain. That's a digression. Joel, do you have any other thoughts about virtue and how we see it now versus then, the idea of cultivating virtue? Any other thoughts you want to talk about here in the Felicity of Virtue chapter?
The addendum I wanted to add to this was the archaeological studies I remember reading about, one of them being Shannadeer Cave, or Shannadeer 1, which was a Neanderthal male, and the current expectation is that it was approximately 50,000 years ago, and I can't remember all the details, but it was a man who was severely disabled. And through the archaeological studies, their interpretation is that he was cared for by the community despite having such a severe disability, showing community care and almost a level of altruism that perhaps we once did not expect from hunter-gatherers.
Right. On the surface level, that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but then as you learn more about even current hunter-gatherer societies, there is a lot of cohesion there and group solidarity.
Right. And I think that in itself lends to the idea that humans have been altruistic for a long time. Even if it is not utilitarian, it still provides this community cohesion that makes us stronger in the long run.
Keep in mind the community cohesion, thinking about hunter-gatherers, and let's look at a claim that Haidt makes that on the surface, knee-jerk reaction, people might not be very happy about it. But hear him out, okay? You ready for it, Joel? So Haidt claims that there is an unintended downside to diversity in our society. Based on a study that he and his students conducted, he found that, quote, diversity is like cholesterol. There's a good kind and a bad kind, and perhaps we should not be trying to maximize both. Liberals are right to work for a society that is open to people of every demographic group, but conservatives might be right in believing that at the same time, we should work much harder to create a common shared identity, end quote. Joel, what do you think about this idea before we define it a little bit more?
The thought of the idea is we see other cultures, communities, countries perform extremely well when they have homogenous populations because they have a shared identity, because they have a shared cohesion. And there are benefits and detriments to those, but same thing that we see here in America and other integrated cultures, we see benefits and detriments therein as well.
I think it's just an interesting commentary on where our society is at and where our culture is at, that people can have a knee-jerk negative reaction to this claim. What do you mean diversity is bad? And what he's saying here is, I really like the nuance of what he's saying here and how balanced it really is. This book is, I think, approaching 20 years old, but the level of nuance and breadth of his viewpoint here, I think, is very refreshing and could be evergreen and useful today, which is taking the best parts of what is a traditionally left liberal way of thinking and the best good intention parts of what a traditional right or conservative way of thinking is. And not to digress, but there is evidence that there's personality, which way you are thinking and tending to show up in the world, conservatively or liberally, is partially part of your personality, which is very interesting. Why is he saying this? Just like we were talking about with the hunter-gatherers, if you think about a hunter-gatherer group, they have a strong shared identity. They have a strong shared group identity. It is very easy for them to cultivate and maintain social trust and a strong social glue. But if people from 3, 4, 5 different cultures suddenly showed up and started living in that society with that hunter-gatherer group, just for the sake of a thought experiment here, then immediately you would have a blob of people, a blob group that then is trying to renegotiate what their shared identity is. And the things they have in common are now, on average, less. There's less things they have in common, and so they almost have to create or manufacture a shared identity. And that takes time and effort and shared hardships, shared joys, so that they can slowly build that trust. Now, the benefit to the group of having these other people from other cultures is that now they get access to another variety of ideas, even at the genetic level, they get more access to a variety of genetic data, which creates a more robust and resilient group immune system. So that if, everyone that's in this group has a vulnerability to, a particular germ, particular virus, introducing more people into the community would broaden the potential defenses, immunologically speaking. But same thing intellectually. Intellectually, the group's immune system is now reinforced because there's different viewpoints to help bolster things we don't think about, So on every level, there is a benefit to having diversity in that sense, at the cost of less social trust and cohesion if it's not balanced properly, or if it's a little out of order of which one is being increased on what side. So I really like his metaphor there of cholesterol, good kind, bad kind.
The context is extremely important when relating the diversity included in the group. So you're talking about people piling in together, and we can see a real life example in the development in the early 1900s of New York City, where you had a whole bunch of different immigration coming in, and what ultimately ended up developing, however you want to think about it, better or worse, is you had the Italians all living together in the same area because they had a shared cultural identity and cohesion and a way that they interacted with each other. The Chinese had their own little area. You have Little Tokyo and San Francisco. You have these immigration stories that end up having people bring a lot to the community and bring a lot to it. America would not have benefited nearly as much. One of the reasons that America grew, became so technologically savvy, and became so industrial was because of the immigration that we had here. And there's no taking away from the fact that we had so many wonderful immigrants bringing technology, information, and ways of living that has made us a rich culture. So the context they're in is extremely important, but it's also okay that people like Little Italy or Little China in New York City, they develop their own cohesion only because it's easier to work within those confines because there's already predetermined agreed rules. And those rules don't have to be hard rules. Even in a family unit, they have their own culture. Every family has a culture. So when you enter that house, they have a way of interacting with each other, and they know those soft boundaries that aren't spoken or written down.
Good context. And just to reiterate, he is not saying diversity itself is not good. He's just saying it's a more subtle thing than that. Diversity brings enormous long-term advantages, like we talked about: innovation, resilience, creativity, broader perspectives, even economic dynamism. But human psychology does not automatically adapt smoothly to that. So societies must intentionally cultivate shared identities and institutions strong enough to hold diverse people together. So like you were saying, you've got the Italian community in New York, you got Little China, you got these different sectors that have those shared communities, but underneath all of that, to make the society work, there needs to be a shared identity that they can all participate in. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of tribes.
Right, but and where I was going with that is each of those communities more or less agreed to the American ideals. They agreed to American law. They agreed to a upper hierarchy that they could work within the society that they're given. And they've, in many ways, flourished, and America didn't always treat them the best, but they still were able to integrate because of the broader hierarchy that they agreed to. They followed the laws, is what I'm saying.
Right. And this chapter is here to, again, pit another supporting pillar into the happiness hypothesis, and this is going to be an external factor towards happiness. If you are in an environment with low social trust, low social cohesion, then you're not going to have a strong sense of community and identity that will help reinforce external forms of happiness, external influences on your happiness. So that's why he has this in here. So that idea, fascinating presentation. Any other thoughts, Joel, that you have that you want to talk about that one? Otherwise, we're going to move on.
There is exactly one other thing I do want to bring up because
no more, no less.
I love it. Have you heard about the love raft experiment that happened?
I think so. Give us a reminder.
It was in 1973, and I only remember because I listened to a podcast on the Dollop about this very recently, then read more about it. But Santiago was a social experimenter and a researcher. And to make it short, he had 11 participants, 5 men and 6 women, from a whole bunch of different nationalities, religions, completely different backgrounds. And his goal was to find out why people get into conflicts. Why do we fight, and how can we navigate that to make a better cohesive world and have less war in itself? So his ultimate goal was to understand the rise of conflict and fighting. However, he made this raft. It was a very poorly designed raft on purpose to cross the Atlantic Ocean. It would take a long time. He made sure that the quarters were cramped. He made sure everything was uncomfortable. People were around each other. There was no personal space. And so he was increasing as much as he could the friction and strife that would rise in between the individuals. He also made sure every single one of them was, for lack of a better word, kind of more sexually available or single, things like that. And he made sure that they were attractive. And he was hoping that there would be like sexual jealousy developing and all this stuff, right? Anything to make people fight.
And when was this?
1973.
So reality TV before TV.
Yes. And so he was like, okay, I'm going to figure out when the conflict starts. He had a whole bunch of like questionnaires he'd hand out every day. After 101 days, what ultimately happened was everyone got along. Everyone ended up actually enjoyed being around each other. And despite having almost completely different ethnicities, backgrounds, religions, and everything else, people came together cohesively and made the 101-day voyage. And it worked out beautifully, and he was very upset and angry because they wouldn't fight, because they actually came together as a group of humans.
You ruined my experiment.
Little marble in the bucket for understanding the value and use of diversity. And they still had the same underlying, again, in my understanding of that experiment, they still had the same underlying humanity of caring for each other and wanting to accomplish a goal.
And to Jonathan Haidt's point, they had the shared identity of us versus the ocean, us versus the voyage.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, Joel, that is a great pin in that conversation on that idea presented by Haidt. Now, I'd like us to chit-chat about Chapter 9.
Now we're going to take a break so I can put in the interlude music.
Okay, let's jump straight into Chapter 9, Divinity with or without God. Haidt proposes a 3D model for human relationships. He gives an idea of an x-axis of closeness, a y-axis of hierarchy, and a z-axis of divinity, okay? So this is, of course, an audio format, so I can't draw you a nice picture or 3D model. But let's just think about, a graph here, an XYZ axis on a graph. X is closeness, how close we are to each other. Y-axis would be hierarchy, so think of human psychology status, so like how we think of status relative to each other and in groups. But then he proposes a z-axis, okay, so you're picturing the 2D XY axis, but now add a z-axis for divinity. And for divinity here, he describes this axis as the human perception of sacredness. Moving up in this axis is to feel uplifted, spiritually elevated, and in the opposite direction, moving down or in the negative direction on this axis, is to feel disgust. So a feeling of disgust is the opposite of a human feeling of sacredness and spiritual elevation. Haidt brings up this axis of divinity to argue that moving up makes it easier to treat others and yourself better, to better ourselves, and to have happy, meaningful lives. And he spent a long time coming to this conclusion with the studies he ran himself. And he kept bumping up against there's something beyond just a degree of closeness and a sense of status. There's an additional thing. And he uses several terms and words to come around to it. Perusing the research he's done over the years, it is a very interesting direction of thought, and it makes a lot of sense. And he's saying that there's a sense of divinity, whether we are religious or not, whether we're atheistic or not, that we have a natural sense of sacredness, and that exists on an axis with sacredness in one direction and disgust in the other. And if you are higher up on that experience, if you're able to tap into that human connection with what is we feel to be sacred, it's much easier to treat the person next to you and yourself better and more in tune with that spectrum. Super interesting thought. Great read. Joe, what did you think about this
I agree with him, and I would say for people that aren't religious or spiritual at all, even if there is no divinity for you, I think having divine connection, and divine's not the right word here, but having a connection to something larger, even if that's like Earth, and you go out, and I feel this very keenly when I'm camping or hiking for multiple days, where I feel very connected to the forest or mountain or wherever I'm at that time, just because there is such a living in the moment experience that it feels supernatural, that it feels extraordinary. In our modern day, it's easy to disconnect from that feeling of spiritual connection, for lack of a better word, but without houses and without all of this comfort that we have here, you are stuck out in the wilderness, out in the woods, where you see the stars every night, where you see the sunrise and sunset, where you notice the activity of animals to a much higher predilection. And with that, I think it's much easier for those people, because you're around it every single day, to have that type of, again, I blanking on a better word here, but that spiritual connection, or that connection to something larger, and in this case, just Earth is enough.
Right. Connection to something larger, I think, is another good way of describing the general direction that's being discussed here.
And there's so much to gain from that. Even if you, in my opinion, even if you were to say there is no divinity, life after death, there is no deity or spirit or anything, if there's nothing, if you're like a nihilist, you could still gain, and you could still have a utilitarian value to pretending, because you can connect to something else, because you can relate to that and work better towards being a better self or being a better person within your connection. Because ultimately, nihilist or not, you can never be separate from the interconnectivity of everything, including other people. You would not be you without having been born. You would not be you if there wasn't all the connections to every single person in your community, or the earth, or the food, or anything else that you are related to. You can't exist in a vacuum. So even just a utilitarian, nihilistic standpoint, you gain a value to having some type of sacred and profane separation.
The little book, Sacred and Profane by Mircea Eliade, is a much broader expansion of this idea. And of course, that's a much older book, and it is a difficult read. We did an in-person read of that with our book club, but I would say that to get the gist of that little book and the ideas in it is very beneficial. But reading this chapter that Jonathan Haidt has here gives the same ideas in a much better, easier to digest format. The ideas that are presented in Sacred and Profane are very useful, but Jonathan Haidt has just packaged them in a much better way. And so, briefly detouring to Sacred and Profane, in that book, Mircea Eliade is using different words. So to kind of blend the two ideas together, he's saying that humans experience sacred, and the opposite for him would be profane. Not necessarily negative, but profane as in opposite of sacred or spiritual. Profane more as like everyday daily life without that spiritual elevation component, and that both are needed, and working together that's what leads to happiness and feelings of meaningfulness for individuals and groups. An interesting thought that is presented in this discussion in Jonathan Haidt's book is that there's religious communities out there who are much stricter and much more monolithic in their religiosity. Think of separatist-like cultures that live within broader cultures. Amish, for example. The levels of happiness among the Amish are much, much higher, and on the surface level, that seems counterintuitive because of the level of restrictiveness that we think their religion gives them and their religious practices give them. But that's just not the case, and they're more in tune with what Jonathan Haidt's talking about here, the upper end of that sacred elevation axis.
The way that people can interact in a divine or spiritual way, and how you connect to that, or how communities connect to it more specifically. It's much more focused on communities. And so with those communities and how they define cosmic order and how they can approach the profane or reach that liminal space, that in-between space, is a powerful tool that, the community might know, and we kind of lose that with our more ambiguous religiosity nowadays, in my opinion, because people had much more ritualistic structure to their life beforehand.
Right, and think about rites of passage.
Yes.
Rites of passage is a cultural vehicle for experiencing many of the things that we're talking about here. It lets you access in a shared practice way. Yes, group identity, cultural cohesion, and shared values, but also this exact thing we're talking about, the spiritual elevation. So we have a paucity of rites of passage nowadays in our culture, and we also, not coincidentally, have a paucity of access to, especially group access to, spiritual elevation. And the natural kind of thought experiment that is presented by reviewing all this information to me is, Joel, would you trade some moral and social freedom to live in a community or country where the sacred dimension was more a part of daily life? Interesting question, right?
It's a tough question because we really pride ourselves on that freedom, that will to do whatever you want in our society. And yet, for societies that lack some of those freedoms, we actually see a larger level of happiness for those communities. Would you be willing to give up those freedoms to have more happiness? But everything can be profaned, and we can look at Jonestown as the easiest example of people gave up freedoms to feel a happiness.
Haidt says that a major obstacle to moving up on this sacred axis is the self itself, actually, which we can define as conscious verbal thinking. The self puts up a constant stream of trivial concerns and egocentric thoughts that keeps people locked in the material and profane world, unable to perceive sacredness and divinity. That is I didn't say a quote, but that was a direct quote from the discussion here. Spiritual growth also requires that the self dies to a certain degree, which causes the self to put up stubborn, fierce resistance. And I really like this idea that spiritual growth requires some parts of you to die. I think that is a very valuable way of looking at it, because you don't get, it's the idea of growth only happens outside your comfort zone is a much simpler, less nuanced version of what is being talked about here. But it applies here because by definition, getting outside of your comfort zone is a part of you dying. It's that part that is comfortable dying into that which is less comfortable, but that is ultimately growing. You're also growing because of that.
The rituals are ways of connecting to the community, or the heterofanity that the Sacred and Profane talks about, that looks at ways of transforming people's self-identity to a broader context. And I think the easiest one to connect to on the personal level is death, like you're talking about, the self-death. Part of that is like pseudo-death before your actual death, so that you can see the ways you can give to a immortality project.
And I'm sure we've discussed this before, but feeling a connection to something larger than yourself is very much a way to experience more happiness, more calmness. There's been many experiments done in many different directions that show this. The more you feel connected to something larger than yourself, the calmer you feel, the less anxious you feel. It just helps you be in tune with this axis that Haidt's talking about here. Ego death. So another thing that Haidt says is that, quote, only by seeing the self in this way can one understand and even respect the moral motivations of those who want to make their society conform more closely to the particular religion they follow, end quote. So what he's talking about here is looking at the best intentions behind people who want to make the society they live in more adherent and more adherent to the religion that they ascribe to. So proselytization, spreading of a faith, he's saying the best intention behind that is something that we need to look at to truly understand the motive there. That's the only way you can understand it, even respect those moral motivations behind people who want to increase religious conformity. Because on the one hand, especially in a diverse culture like the one we have, if just on the surface level, that idea of increasing religious conformity sounds counterintuitive to the level of ideological diversity that is present. And it's like, hey, why are you doing that? I don't want to follow your XYZ religion, XYZ faith. That's great that you do it, but don't necessarily push it on me. And what Haidt's saying here is that the best way to understand that is, hey, understand that they are trying to promote access to the sacred access as an individuals and as a group. Okay, so moving on. And again, remember this book is a few decades old at this point, and he was writing about culture wars in his own time. Quote, many of the key battles in the American culture war are essentially about whether some aspect of life should be structured by the ethic of autonomy or by the ethic of divinity, end quote. So let's define those there. He's talking about ethic of autonomy versus ethic of divinity. Autonomy is individuals are what's important. You should be allowed to do what you want as long as it doesn't harm someone else. So that's the essential ethic of autonomy. Everyone can understand that. Ethic of divinity is essentially an argument saying that each person has divinity with them, so we should live in a way that's spiritually uplifting and nourishing. The ideal society helps people live in a way consistent with that divinity. What an individual desires is not particularly important. Many desires come from the carnal self, end quote. Joel, do one of these arguments, one of these ways of ethics ring more true to you?
I think people will be happy given, roles in society, given the ability to contribute to the divinity or the community or just connecting to something larger. And ultimately, I think that's what people connect to more and live longer. I see older people living longer and better lives if they feel needed. Despite what you would think that, they're free and liberated to do what they want, I actually see the people that are like, oh no, I have to be around for my grandchild, or I have to do this thing. I still have this task to be done that is helping others. There's task connected to other people, meaning that they have more fulfilled lives. So almost like the obligation in itself provides more for the individual.
Okay. Another way that he presents this argument in the book, I think, is a really great way to look at it. So we've got the ethic of autonomy, ethic of divinity. He just asked the reader, quote, which of the following quotations inspires you more? Self-esteem is the basis of any democracy, or it's not all about you, and why? And I really like the presentation there because that sums it up even more. And like you said, it's hard to choose between the two because there's things about both that are appealing. Some days I really resonate with the idea that, quote, it's not all about you. And then at the same time, self-esteem or self-worth being the basis of democracy makes sense. I don't know. I think most of the time for most arguments, it's not all about you rings a little bit more resonant with me.
As Irish Murdoch explained to us in a beautiful book that I didn't finish, The Sea, it's finally time to think about me.
That is the best quote from that book. And I went, 100 or 200 pages further into that book than you. And same thing. I just had to stop it, and we will maybe talk about that in one of our miscellaneous grab bag episodes. I would love to discuss that book and my feelings on it compared to other books. It is not a bad book. It is extremely well written, but that is a fun conversation for us to have.
So without getting deeper into it, my point there is Murdoch warns us of the type of life that the first one can lead to if it's overindulged. The self-esteem or self-worth ends up leading a person to self-destruction and destruction of those around them. So I often find it's not all about you, quote, as we see in Jonathan Haidt's book here, resonates more because the better you are at connecting with the community, whatever that community is, the more you'll ultimately end up getting personal fulfillment.
I agree. That just resonates a little bit more with me. And looking at this chapter more broadly, the thing that I find that's fascinating is, again, this is a 20-year-old chapter. He's talking about culture wars at the time, and to me, it could be written today. To me, it makes sense. Even though he's talking about specific stuff happening 20 years ago, it fits now the arguments that are happening now, the quote culture wars that are happening now. It can be brought down to, I think, an argument between these two ethics, these two kind of divergent, non-overlapping things that pull in opposite directions. Self-worth versus it's not all about you. Diametrically opposed. Classic individualism versus group.
And I think we're still having that discourse in our society today, like you said.
And to use a phrase that Joel doesn't like me using, bug or feature, I think it's mostly a feature of our culture that we have that constant tug of war back and forth. Then there's something out of that tension pulling in both directions that allows, a unified direction to come out of. Just a little bit more chaotic. So to tie in here, a thought by Ernest Becker, Haidt thinks that the best way to bridge the divide is to not be tempted by the, quote, myth of pure evil, end quote, and to be able to see what the other side gets right. And myth of pure evil is something that, Ernest Becker also talks about of, hey, this is the dangerous side of having a hero system, is that to be a hero, you need a villain in most traditional hero systems. So Joel, do you think he is right that the best way to bridge this divide is to not be tempted by the myth of pure evil?
I don't know if that's the best way to bridge the divide. I do agree with this supposition of the myth of pure evil. We can see that in literature, movies, where a villain that is just pure evil is typically a boring villain because they're not real. They don't exist.
But they're easy to hate and oppose.
Easy to hate and oppose.
And
exactly.
The myth there is, if you are a particular political event and you're posing your political opponents as pure evil, it makes your job a lot easier, but it entrenches that diametric opposition and entrenches the fighting rather than seeking common ground. And you can't seek common ground with someone who you think of or portray as pure evil. Well, the other side's just completely wrong and they want to ruin this country. And there's no common ground with that, because now you've created a pure evil enemy rather than someone who has their own particular way of thinking that's different than yours. Any other thoughts you have here?
No, I don't have any other thoughts. I'm just trying to think of how you would bridge that divide, because I don't think we really get a good answer here in the literature.
Yeah, I don't know that there is a good answer, because in my mind, you need both. You need to you need a balance between the group and the individual, because traditionally in history, if you see where the group just completely dominates individuals and individualism, that leads to its own kind of stagnation morally, politically, societally. And in the opposite direction, if individualism completely takes priority over the group, then you don't have a group, and then you just don't exist for any significant amount of time in history. So there does need to be a balance in my mind, and this applies at every level that I can think of. The family unit, the people you work with, a neighborhood, a city, a country, at any level, it just makes sense. Like, you need the best of individualism that doesn't come at the cost of the group, and vice versa. You need the group, the community, as cohesive and as strong as possible without crushing and just completely dominating individualism. But they're diametrically opposed, and so it's a balance system. How it's done, no idea.
Yep.
The question that we are perennially asking for all of human history.
Yeah, not going to get the answer to that question.
Let us make our way towards the final version of the happiness hypothesis. We have gone through each of these chapters. We have seen his various big ideas presented throughout the book that he's examined and that we have taken a deep dive along with him. And so now that we have all these ideas on the table, we've examined them, the final version of the happiness hypothesis that we are presented with is that, quote, happiness comes from between, end quote. Haidt says that the right question is, what should I do to have a good, happy, fulfilling, and meaningful life? And the answer is to strive to get the relationship right between the writer and the elephant, your life story and your goals, your connection to something larger than yourself, and your connection to those around you. And I really like his conclusion here because that makes sense, and he pulls in the internal, the external, and that it's a balance. The image that cannot help but come to mind is, of course, the yin-yang symbol. Joel, what is your opinion of this final version of the happiness hypothesis we are presented with here?
He gets some things right that we see echoed through other literary works and historical religious texts, where getting relationships connected in between what your meaning and purpose is, as well as connecting to people around you, ultimately leads us to the best chance of being happy.
Any other, like you said, he gets some things right, so do you feel as if he got something off or that something's missing from his definition? Because I don't see that at all. I think he absolutely nailed it.
He doesn't pull in the good scientific empirical methods that we have available for us to dive deeper into the psychology and individual versus community structures that we have here. He also has overreaching, and we'll talk about this here in a minute as well, he has overreaching conclusions without proper backing.
That is fascinating because I don't agree at all. I think and now I'm remembering our first conversation on this book months and months ago. I don't agree with that at all. But I am very glad that we have something to disagree about. Before we go into our usual closing sections on a book and talking about overall opinions and the different quotes and the good reviews and bad reviews, any other takeaways?
No? Do you have any other takeaways? Do you have any other impressions or anything else you want to pull into this?
I think my main takeaway is that sense of balance. That, I think he nailed it, and that's something that, again, I read this book months ago and it has stuck with me, is the balance between the rider and the elephant, the balance between individualism and group, the balance from finding connection to the people around you, but also connection with something larger than yourself. To me, that really resonates, and it is a really good cohesion of various ideas that have been presented throughout history. And I think he takes his, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit, like you said, but I think he takes his empirical background as a sociologist and applies it very well in this subjective realm. So that's my only takeaway, and that is, in general, my opinion of the book itself. So Joel, what is your overall opinion of the book?
I thought the book was really good. It definitely lingered longer than it needed to in certain sections, but it really added a lot of stuff. And taking away from the book itself, where you pick just a few kernels to really chew on and get a deeper flavor of that, I think he can use that to be applied for this book and other books. Try not to just skip along the surface of too many topics and rather delve deeper into a smaller number of topics. I think that is going to lend us towards understanding ourselves, our relationship to others, and our communities, where we can find our own personal path towards happiness. Because each individual is unique, but at the end of the day, we're all just human, and usually the same things that make us tick keep on ticking.
Okay, now let's run through some quotes that are from the book, either from Haidt himself or other thinkers that he has quoted from. So this first one is him discussing different ways of viewing love, and this is a fun one added in here to our notes that is a good parting thought to think about. Quote, "If you are in passionate love and want to celebrate your passion, read poetry. If your ardor has calmed and you want to understand your evolving relationship, read psychology. But if you have just ended a relationship and would like to believe you are better off without love, read philosophy." End quote. I like that thought, and I like the encouragement to read more.
Okay, another one that he used from Leo Tolstoy, quote, "One can live magnificently in this world if one knows how to work and how to love, to work for the person one loves and to love one's work," end quote.
He also throws in a quote from Buddha, Quote, what we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. End quote. Great thought. Really applicable to his idea of balance.
All right, and ending it on one of Haidt's quotes itself within the book, quote, happiness is not something that you can find, acquire, or achieve directly. You have to get the conditions right and then wait. Some of those conditions are within you, such as a cohesion amongst the parts and levels of your personality. Other conditions require relationships to things beyond you. Just as plants need sun, water, and good soil to thrive, people need love, work, and a connection to something larger. It is worth striving to get the right relationships in between yourself and others, between yourself and your work, and between yourself and something larger than yourself. If you get those relationships right, a sense of purpose and meaning will emerge. End quote.
All right, Joel, you compiled bad reviews and critiques.
As we always do for our books now, we're going to go through the bad reviews and critiques and then go through the good reviews and merits, basically. All right, the first collection of bad reviews I could find, and I'm just going to summarize those as we always do. The research is inconclusive, and he doesn't give any credence to valuable research disagreements. And this is going to be from one of the reviewers. 1. Explain away the cultural status quo as a natural consequence of biological human nature. 2. Presents all of his ideas as scientific consensus where there are very few non-controversial conclusions in positive psychology. It's fine for him to stick with his theories, but his disinterest in bringing up these disagreements leaves me very distrusting of him. And 3. Make readers shudder a little bit when they recognize the writer is coming from a space of extreme privilege and remains ignorant of the lives that most people live.
Joe, what are your thoughts on this critique?
All right. So my understanding when I was doing some research about the book and behind the book is there is some research disagreements to the work that he's done. There are people that have work pointing in other directions, and he is critiqued in this book by academics and lay people for not adding anything to other people's research that goes against his work. And that's okay. We see researchers do that all the time, especially in psychology, because it's a softer science and it's harder to get more concrete evidence, as you would find in physics or chemistry. And so it's hard. I'm not lamenting him for not doing that in this more layperson-oriented book, but he does conclude things in a more or less scientific way when there's so much academic evidence against his work.
That's a fair understanding of this critique and what this person is saying. I just fundamentally disagree with this critique, and I think it's overblown. And I think this is a common mistake of people being upset when something that is based off of a subjective primary ground is not as objective as they would like. And to me, it's just a misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding of what the raw data is that's being dealt with here. And that can be seen in the way we look at, quote, hard science and soft science. And that is not necessarily meant to be disparaging, but people purposefully or unconsciously see that in a disparaging way. Oh, well, one's soft and one's hard. And I think a more nuanced understanding of the difference between the two is that one is objective. Math is objective. It's an objective way you can look at things. Physics, chemistry, purely objective, because you can build on, empirical data like from the start. You don't have to worry about the subjective details of the squishy, hard to define ways of things like you find in psychology and sociology of, well, how does someone feel about this? How does someone, you can't quantify yet someone's personality traits, character traits, the way they show up in the world, because we are constantly in flux. We are quintessentially subjective because we are subjects, and we bring to bear our subjectiveness as individuals in any group dynamic and any level of abstraction or zoomed in, zoom out that you can. You cannot escape the subjectiveness. And you have empirical ways of viewing the hard sciences, looking at objective data. And what is happening in the subjective realm is you have to do what you can with the conclusions you can draw, because you're overlaying a level of empiricism and objectivity onto a foundation of what is subjective. And to lament the fact that, we can't have any purely concrete conclusions like we can in a, quote, hard science, means that you can't have absolute statements, or you can't have conclusive statements. And I understand that line of thinking, but it's just too narrow-minded in my viewpoint. And I understand we disagree with that, and we're sitting mostly on opposite sides of the fence of this particular critique and bad review, and I'm glad that we do have this to disagree about.
Isn't that so nice that we get to disagree?
I am happy we get to disagree. Finally, time to disagree.
The other thing I'll say for this, coming from a hard science background, is I think he could have foregone these types of critiques if he did something that Peter Attia did in his book when he was talking about, I think it was ripamycin, I forget how to pronounce
It's rapamycin.
The medicine he was talking about. But he puts in there, things aren't concluded. It was like just a little throwaway at the end of that. And I think Haidt would have benefited greatly against these types of critiques if, in some of the sections where he talks about his research, if he had just added one line at the end saying, studies are still being done on this.
I would agree if his information and thoughts were being presented in the same order of operations that were happening in that health science-based book that we were talking about. However, let's look at the overall project of the book itself, which is examining several large ideas. And so he's actually going in the opposite direction. He's taking wisdom literature and great big ideas from history of thought and philosophy, and then adding on findings and directions from psychology and sociology. So you don't have to sit there and say, someone disagrees with Buddha, there's evidence against what Buddha's saying. You're just not engaging at all with the subjective nature of what wisdom literature is.
I mean, only when he brings up his research studies. When he brings up studies, that's it.
But he's not giving a scientific presentation here. He's adding science to wisdom literature, so he doesn't need to. You run the risk of having the book run even longer. It's not his responsibility to say, well, I mentioned this one particular thing. However, there's 5 other studies that say something that makes the data a little bit more divergent. That just takes away from his overall point of what he's saying. If something is in disagreement with what he's saying, that's great, but that's outside the scope of what this book is about, which is essentially, how do you be happy? And to say that just look at his overall conclusion. Regardless of what he says in his various chapters, it's almost completely subjective, the conclusion he comes up with, and it can't be anything but subjective, because happiness itself is subjective. We as humans are subjective. How we interact, view ourselves, our narration is all subjective. And so the preponderance of evidence that he brings to bear, that's why it's wisdom literature combined with sociology and psychology. And it has to be that way. He's not saying at the end of the day, like, this is a universal concrete truth written into the laws of physics in the universe that is just diametrically different than what we are talking about. Happiness cannot be objectified. And the fact that he brings in an empirical way of thinking about the wisdom literature and the psychology and sociology, I think, is refreshing and adds nuanced ways of looking at stuff. Like, for example, the diversity conversation we had. He's applying an empirical, objective way of looking at a messy human subjective situation. And I think that's a great way to build up to his argument.
What a great way. But you bring up the second part of what a lot of critiques are, which is number 2. The book is not concise enough, or it just quotes other things and then wastes time with waffling and fluff. And to quote some of the critiquers, it was crazy annoying to get to his points. There is no way he needed that many words to make the points he had. This reading drove me insane. If this book interests you, just read the last few pages of each chapter and pull the key messages from it that way. And another one, it's not worth reading, not at all. Read the sources he misread instead.
Let's see how many pages this is. The standard hardcover edition of this book has 320 pages. If you can't read a 320-page book, I can't help you. This is not a long book. That is to be completely subjective here, that is a completely unfair critique. He could not be more concise. To be more concise, you would need a Twitter quote. If you can't read a 320-page book, why are you reading? Sorry. This reviewer is...
Leo, don't insult the listeners of ours that come to us so they don't have to read the books.
That we are doing them a service, but we are taking multiple hours to go through this.
Okay. All right. Anything else you want to say on that critique?
Probably. Let me think about it. The book is not concise.
Again, I would like to reiterate to our listeners and to Leo, these are not my thoughts. These are not my critiques. These are simply... I go through.
Yeah, just go and find
what's really going to upset Leo.
Yeah, what's going to upset Leo? For the listeners who can't see Joel's smarmy face right now, he is grinning from ear to ear.
I'm adding to the discourse of this by reading through all of the bad reviews, Leo. And let me tell you, I spared you. You think I pulled the ones that hurt you? I spared you from, and I'm going to cut this next section.
Well, I could keep going on these negative reviews, but...
okay. All right. The last...
Take me to the last conglomeration of reviews.
The last summation of a whole bunch of bad reviews or critiques is, number 3, the book does not do what the title says it will. This is from the reviewer. Quote, I even slonged through his Freudian references. I did this because I like the idea of positive psychology, supporting the good mental health instead of focusing on the abnormal psychology. I thought this book was about ancient wisdom, but it really is about modern psychology, not truth. Parentheses, exclamation, exclamation, exclamation. That has antecedents in ancient wisdom, and for every 1 or 2 lines about the ancient wisdom, there are 100 about his so-called truth.
I think Freud would have something to say about those parenthetical exclamation marks, so this person probably needed to read some more Freud stuff. I don't even remember there being that much talk of Freud, if any, so I don't know that this person knows what they are talking about. And they're complaining because they like psychology, but they also like ancient wisdom, but they're upset that there's modern psychology mixed in with ancient wisdom. I thought that was a beautiful blend of things. I immensely enjoyed the combination of modern psychology and ancient wisdom literature. I don't understand what this person's upset about. I think
this was the most cohesive one in this subsection that I could really give you. But there were a lot saying he didn't discuss this, or another one which was a super long quote, which is why I didn't add it to our outline. Kind of like a diatribe of, so it's just a genetic gamble. And then he goes on, for the whole book explaining how to deal with the genetic gamble that you lost if you're just sad. Or he's attacking introverts and he doesn't really tell you anything about happiness or how to be happy.
Those people either didn't read or don't know how to read.
So there you go. That's
what
the
I
last
mean
collection.
by not know how to read is can you not piece together the various parts of the book into cohesive ideas? Because that's what he does. He takes big idea, breaks it down, looks at it from different angles, brings in modern and ancient thought, and then he brings it all back together in a beautiful thing. I think it's well done. These you just pick out these bad reviews just to rile me up.
These aren't even the worst written critiques.
Right.
Okay.
It's just the ones that could actually be read on air.
Do you have any other thoughts or feelings on these critiques, or shall we move to the good reviews?
Yes, but let's move on to the good reviews.
Okay. All right. Again, summarizing a whole bunch of them, the number one I read through all of these different reviews is, number 1, the book gives a good insight into ancient societies and ties it to modern psychology. From one of the readers, quote, this book is about the top 10 theories of modern research on happiness. Each chapter of the book is an attempt to get acquainted with a theory that has been discovered by a number of world civilizations, end quote.
Okay. That is an okay summary of what the book is.
That's a lot of what the reviews were.
So that's the main thrust that you saw? What is the other thrust of good reviews that you saw?
So amongst the other 5-star reviews that I was reading through, this is probably another main thrust, which is basically number 2. I really resonated with the message of the whole book.
You want me to read this
Please.
Longer one here? I'll take care of this for you. Quote, the take-home message as it relates to planning and bringing about changes in attitude and behavior is to not focus so much on our conscious thought, the writer, and the typical rational analysis of a situation in order to influence a decision, but rather to find ways to train the elephant to think and behave differently. Haidt suggests personal work to understand and improve ourselves as individuals, offering up meditation, cognitive therapy, and Prozac as the three main pathways.
Great.
That's a great summary. And, like this reviewer, I too really resonated with the main message here and the way it was presented.
All right. One last 5-star review from a different reader. Quote, it is an insightful read backed up by empirical data from research, both his and by others. Haidt breaks down how humans have developed and lived together. How can we ascend to greater heights or fall to tragic depths? All of this is in the search of one question asked 2 ways. What is the meaning of life? For some people, it is better asked, what is the purpose of life? For others, how do we get meaning out of our lives?
So that is it. That is our conversation on happiness hypothesis. Thank you for joining us on this journey through this book. We are happy you're here. We're happy you're listening. Let's wrap this up and come and see us next time. Joel, where can they reach us?
They can reach us at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com, Patreon/deepdivebookclub, X at deepdivebc, Instagram at deepdivebookpod, YouTube at deepdivebookpod. I said the Instagram one wrong. Deep Dive Book Club.
Right.
But if you type that in, you'll find us anyway.
You'll find us. We're out there.
We are out there and we are here. And now we're not going to be here until next week.
Yep. We will disappear from existence until next week. Okay. Well, we will talk to you guys next week.
See y'all then.